Imagine producing a 600-page, highly complex historical narrative in just about 65 working days.
Right, which is already a stretch.
Yeah, but now imagine doing it without an outline, without any notes, and with your face buried inside a hat.
It sounds impossible.
Completely. But we've got a really fascinating deep dive for you today. We are looking at a stack of primary sources from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And these documents, they basically detail the origin, the translation mechanics, and the surviving historical artifacts behind the Book of Mormon, as well as another canonized text called the Pearl of Great Price.
And honestly, the sheer volume of historical data here is what makes this so compelling. I mean, we are looking at a paper trail that includes eyewitness accounts, hostile academic reactions, and even physical manuscript evidence that's been analyzed with modern multispectral imaging.
Which is wild.
It really is. It's a completely unique case study in how sacred texts are formed, challenged, and preserved.
Definitely. And the mission of this deep dive is to explore the extraordinary mechanical and historical claims behind how the scripture was actually produced. So whether you are deeply familiar with this specific text or you're just insanely curious about the mechanics of religious history, our goal today is to look past the surface level narrative. We want to understand the granular how and why behind this monumental translation process.
Exactly.
And just to be clear, we are going to examine exactly what the sources say, impartially reporting the historical claims without trying to prove or disprove the theology itself.
Right, because regardless of your personal worldview, the physical mechanisms and the human elements involved in this timeline are just objectively fascinating. I mean, we have a front row seat to the collision of 19th century rural folk culture, claims of ancient artifacts, and the birth of a global religious movement.
So you likely already know the baseline origin story. It's 1820 in upstate New York. A young farm boy named Joseph Smith reads James chapter 1, verse 5, prays in the woods, and reports a vision of God the Father and Jesus Christ.
Yeah, that's the foundational event.
Right. And then 3 years later, an angel named Moroni points him to a buried stone box containing gold plates, which hold the record of ancient inhabitants of the Americas. But what these specific primary sources highlight is the stark, almost uncomfortable contrast between the magnitude of the text and Joseph's total lack of capability.
Oh, absolutely. The sources are really clear on that.
Yeah, his own wife, Emma Smith, who later acts as one of his scribes, she was interviewed extensively about this. She explicitly noted on the historical record that at the time of the translation, Joseph couldn't even dictate a coherent and well-worded letter.
Let alone write a complex, multi-layered book.
Exactly. Okay, let's unpack this. Asking an uneducated farm boy to translate an ancient record is like, well, it's like asking someone who can barely write a text message to suddenly translate an undiscovered ancient epic poem. It defies basic logic.
What's fascinating here is that intersection of human inadequacy and claimed divine intervention.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in the religious narrative, God intentionally uses the weak things of the world to accomplish his purposes so that the credit, it just can't be given to human intellect.
Makes sense from a theological standpoint.
Right. But Joseph wasn't operating in a vacuum where everyone just accepted his word. He faced intense, immediate scrutiny from skeptical scholars. So the sources detail a pivotal event where Martin Harris, who was a relatively wealthy farmer and early financial backer, he demanded proof.
Because he was funding it, right?
Yeah, exactly. So he took a transcript of the copied characters from the plates directly to a prominent linguist at Columbia College in New York City, Professor Charles Anthon.
And the collision between those two worlds, like the rural believer and the elite academic, is incredibly telling. Because according to Harris's account, Anthon actually examined the characters, verified they were authentic, and wrote out a certificate of authenticity.
Right. But then the epistemological wall hits the exact moment the supernatural is introduced. According to the historical account, Anthon asks the obvious question, how did a young man in upstate New York find out about gold plates buried in a hill?
And Harris mentions an angel.
Yep. And instantly, Anthon asks for the certificate back and just tears it to pieces.
Wow. Just rips it up.
Literally tears it up. He declares there is no such thing as ministering angels. And then, when Harris tells him that part of the plates were sealed, Anthon reportedly delivers the famous line, "I cannot read a sealed book."
That reaction just perfectly illustrates the tension. The academic world fundamentally rejects the premise. I mean, secular scholarship requires a standard chain of custody, peer-reviewed linguistics, Rosetta Stones, that sort of thing.
Exactly.
So since academia slammed the door, and Joseph obviously lacked the linguistic skills to decipher a language the text calls Reformed Egyptian, the physical mechanism of translation had to bypass traditional linguistic study entirely.
Right. And the sources describe specific translation instruments that were provided to accomplish this. There were basically two primary devices. The first was called the Urim and Thummim, which the text also refers to as the interpreters.
Which were found with the plates, right?
Yes. Eyewitnesses describe these as two clear stones bound together with a metal rim, somewhat resembling a large pair of spectacles. Joseph found these buried in the stone box right alongside the gold plates.
But the sources also focus heavily on a second instrument, right? A seer stone, and it even had a specific name, gazellum.
Yeah, that's right.
And Joseph actually found this small oval stone years earlier, buried about 30 feet underground while he was digging a well for a neighbor. And he had apparently used it previously in local treasure-seeking ventures looking for lost objects.
And that detail places him firmly within the broader cultural context of the American Northeast at the time. I mean, folk magic and the use of physical objects to glean hidden information were actually quite common then.
It was just part of the culture.
Exactly. But as he grew into his prophetic calling, the sources suggest he elevated the use of this stone for a much higher purpose. And the physical process described by the eyewitnesses in the room is highly, highly specific.
Okay, I have to push back on that process for a second because it sounds incredibly strange, even jarring, to modern ears.
Oh, for sure.
The sources say he would place either the Urim and Thummim or the seer stone into a hat. He would then press his face deeply into the hat to block out all the extraneous room light. And in that darkness, sentences in English would miraculously appear on the instrument.
Right, like glowing text.
Yeah, and he would read them aloud, the scribe would write them down, read them back for accuracy, and then the text would update to the next sentence. I mean, translating a foundational religious text by looking at a rock inside a hat feels like a massive leap to ask anyone to make.
It absolutely challenges our modern, sanitized expectations of how Scripture should be produced. But if we look at the broader historical and theological context, physical objects being used to channel divine power has deep, ancient biblical precedent.
Wait, give me a tangible example of that, because there's a big gap between traditional biblical narratives and a New York farm boy with his face in a hat.
Well, think about the mechanics of the Old Testament. Moses uses a physical wooden rod to part the Red Sea.
Right.
The Israelites are commanded to look at a literal brass serpent on a pole to be healed from venomous bites. The Ark of the Covenant was an actual physical box possessing such intense spiritual power that touching it unauthorized was fatal.
Oh, like Indiana Jones style.
Exactly. And even in the New Testament, Jesus uses dirt mixed with his own saliva to heal a blind man's eyes. Furthermore, ancient Israelite high priests literally used objects called the Urim and Thummim to receive yes or no communications from God.
Oh, okay, that's a fair point.
So the hat was simply a practical tool to block out the ambient light so he could see the illuminated words on the stone. This frames Joseph not as a traditional academic translator poring over Hebrew dictionaries, but as an ancient seer stepping directly into an established biblical tradition.
That reframing really changes everything. It shifts the entire expectation from a scholarly endeavor to a purely revelatory one. But once those mechanics were established, you would think the process would just, hum along.
You would think so.
Instead, the human element immediately throws a massive wrench into the timeline.
Yeah, you're referring to the 116 pages. So Martin Harris, the same man who went to see Professor Anthon, acts as Joseph's primary scribe early on. They labor over the translation, completing 116 manuscript pages.
Which took months, right?
Yes, it was a slow process initially. And Harris, who was desperate to prove to his skeptical wife that he isn't just wasting his time and money, begs Joseph to let him take the manuscript home.
And the sources emphasize that Joseph asks God for permission multiple times and is repeatedly told no.
Right, the answer was a hard no.
But the pressure from Harris is immense, and Joseph finally relents against his better judgment. Harris takes the only copy of the 116 pages, and they vanish. Stolen, presumably by his wife or her associates, and completely lost to history.
The psychological fallout described in the sources is just devastating. Joseph temporarily loses his ability to translate. He is severely reprimanded in a revelation for fearing man more than fearing God.
It's a rough moment for him.
Extremely. It's a very raw human failure that showcases his vulnerability. but it serves as a crucial turning point. He repents, his gift is eventually restored, and a new scribe enters the picture in April 1829, a 22-year-old school teacher named Oliver Cowdery.
And once Oliver sits down at that table, the pace becomes the real story here. The word blistering almost doesn't cover it. They produce the remaining text, nearly 600 printed pages, in an estimated 60 to 65 working days.
That's incredible.
Yeah, that averages out to about 8 pages a day. Now, my immediate question, and the question of any skeptical listener, is how do we know he didn't just pre-write it? Like, maybe he spent those months during the loss of the 116 pages secretly drafting the book, hiding notes in the hat, or just memorizing huge chunks of a pre-written manuscript.
Well, the historical record pushes back hard against that theory through the specific testimonies of the eyewitnesses in the room. Let's look closely at Emma Smith's account from her later years. She stated that the metallic plates often lay right on the table, wrapped in a small linen tablecloth.
So they were just sitting out in the open.
Yeah, right there.
Yeah.
And she was sitting inches away from him, day after day, acting as a scribe before Oliver arrived. She explicitly denied the possibility of hidden notes, stating unequivocally he had neither manuscript nor book to read from.
She goes even further than that, pointing out that if he had anything hidden, he couldn't have concealed it from her.
Exactly. But the most compelling detail she provides is how she described the interruptions. Life on a 19th century farm didn't just stop for this translation.
Right, they had chores to do.
Exactly. They would pause for meals, for chores, to tend to visitors.
Yeah.
When they returned to the tables, Joseph would immediately pick up the dictation exactly where he had left off, without asking her or Oliver to read back the previous sentence to find his place.
Which requires an unbelievable amount of mental bandwidth. I mean, we aren't just talking about a simple linear story here. The Book of Mormon narrative includes multiple interwoven chronologies, complex genealogies, incredibly specific currency systems, changing political structures, and geographic consistencies that span hundreds of years of purported history.
It's a massive web of information.
Right. To hold all of that in your head, stop to eat lunch, and sit back down to dictate the next sentence without reviewing your notes is a staggering cognitive feat.
It is. But eyewitness testimony is a crucial piece of the historical puzzle. But, human memory is notoriously fallible. People can misremember timelines or romanticize events decades later.
Sure, absolutely.
So, to truly test these claims, we have to look past the scribes and examine the physical paper trail left in that translation room.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because you can think of the surviving original manuscript as almost like an airplane's black box recording of the translation process.
I like that analogy.
Yeah, well, a black box captures the exact audio and mechanical conditions in the cockpit at the moment of an event. This manuscript captures the exact auditory conditions of the room, the exact moment the spoken word became text.
But the history of this specific black box is pretty tragic. In 1841, roughly a decade after the book was published, Joseph Smith placed the original manuscript inside the cornerstone of a new building in Illinois called the Nauvoo House.
Like a time capsule.
Exactly, the intent was preservation. But 19th century weatherproofing wasn't exactly advanced. They sealed the stone cavity poorly and groundwater just seeped in. Decades later, when the manuscript was finally recovered, most of it had completely disintegrated into mush.
Oh man, that hurts to hear.
Yeah, today only about 28% survives, mostly in faded, water-stained fragments.
That sounds like a total dead end for researchers, but this is where modern science resurrects 19th century history. The Church History Department utilized multispectral imaging, or MSI technology, on these severely damaged fragments.
Which is such a cool process.
It's amazing. By bombarding the degraded paper with specific wavelengths of ultraviolet, infrared, and visible light, they can penetrate the grime and reflect off the chemical composition of the original iron gall ink. It literally reveals words that have been invisible to the naked eye for over a century.
And what that recovered ink reveals fundamentally supports Emma Smith's account of an oral translation. Because it acts like a black box, the manuscript proves the book was dictated aloud, rather than copied visually from another written draft.
Okay, have me visualize the mechanics of that. If Oliver is copying from another piece of paper, he might mistake an E for a C because they look similar to the I. But you're saying the mistakes on this manuscript are entirely based on how the words sounded echoing around the room.
Precisely. The manuscript is full of what linguists classify as hearing errors rather than reading errors.
Give me an example.
Sure. For example, the scribe wrote down the word weed instead of read in one specific verse. In another instance, Oliver Cowdery spelled the phrase "we're sorrowful" completely phonetically. He wrote WARESARRAFUL.
Wow, where seriful.
Exactly. If he were looking at a written draft with the correct spelling, he wouldn't intentionally write a bizarre phonetic interpretation. He wrote exactly what he heard, sounding it out in real time. There's even a later printer's error, where the typesetter misread Oliver's rushed handwriting and changed the word joy into foes.
The phonetic spelling is kind of the smoking gun for an oral dictation. But the linguistic analysis goes much deeper than just spelling mistakes, right? Scholars analyzing the text have identified highly specific grammatical constructions that sound incredibly awkward in 19th century English, but perfectly reflect ancient Hebraic language structures.
They have. The primary example scholars point to is the conditional if-and structure. In normal English, we say, if you go to the store, then I will make dinner. But ancient Hebrew often structures this as, if you go to the store, and I will make dinner.
Oh, that sounds so clunky.
It does, and the original manuscript is littered with these if-and constructions. They sounded so grammatically incorrect to modern ears that Oliver Cowdery actually went back later and tried to edit them out to make the book read better.
That's wild. And another one the sources mention is the use of cognate accusatives. That's a fancy term for when the verb and the object share the same root.
Right.
So instead of saying he had a dream, the text says he dreamed a dream. Instead of they were taxed, it says they were taxed with a tax.
Yeah, exactly.
These are classic Semitic language markers popping up from a farm boy in upstate New York who had zero access to ancient Hebrew grammar textbooks.
Which raises a really important question. We've looked at the stones, the hat, the blistering speed, the invisible ink, and the Hebrew syntax. But what is the actual output? What is contained in these 600 pages that justified all this effort and sparked a global religious movement?
Right. And at its core, according to the sources, the primary focus of the Book of Mormon is Jesus Christ. He is not a secondary figure in this text. The data shows he is mentioned 3,925 times.
That is a staggering number.
It equates to a mention once every 1.7 verses, utilizing 100 different titles for him names, like the Creator, the Advocate, the Good Shepherd.
And the climax of the entire narrative details his physical, compassionate visit to the ancient inhabitants of the Americas shortly after his resurrection in Jerusalem. The text describes him descending from the sky, allowing the people to feel the wounds in his hands, healing their sick, and blessing their children one by one.
Which is a beautiful image.
It is. It essentially democratizes the biblical narrative, making the claim that God's interactions weren't limited solely to the Middle East.
And that theological expansion didn't stop with the Book of Mormon. You mentioned the Pearl of Great Price earlier in our deep dive. This is another foundational text for the Church, officially canonized in 1880, which contains further vast revelations attributed to Joseph Smith's translation efforts.
The scope of the Pearl of Great Price fundamentally shifts the cosmological worldview of its readers. It includes an account where the ancient prophet Moses is shown the staggering vastness of God's creations.
Right, expanding past just this earth.
Yeah, the text explicitly states there are many worlds that have been created and inhabited. It also contains the writings of Abraham, which introduce profound concepts about a premortal existence. The idea that human spirits existed as distinct individuals with God long before the physical earth was ever formed.
If we look at the sheer scale of where this all led, it is staggering. We started this deep dive talking about an obscure, uneducated boy in a grove of trees in New York in 1820. Today, the Book of Mormon has been fully translated into 92 different languages.
That's massive.
Yeah, and the sources note that the first translation outside of English was Danish, way back in 1851, and it just exploded globally from there.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, for the millions of believers around the world today, the mechanics of the seer stones, the speed of the dictation, or the phonetic spellings on the Nauvoo cornerstone fragments, these are ultimately secondary details.
Because it's about the message.
Exactly. The actual why of the translation process is about the spiritual output. For them, the purpose of the text is to stand as a second witness to the Bible, offering believers a tangible way to draw closer to God and understand his expansive love. The physical history just validates the miraculous nature of the text they already hold sacred.
So what does this all mean? We've covered incredible ground today. We've gone from a boy praying in the woods to clear stones set in silver bows to a seer stone at the bottom of a hat.
It's been quite a journey.
Yeah? We've looked at the psychological devastation of lost manuscripts, the blistering 60-day pace of dictation, and water-damaged pages resurrected by modern laser imaging. Regardless of your personal belief in ministering angels or buried gold plates, understanding the granular physical history of how the Book of Mormon was produced is a masterclass in historical preservation.
It really is.
It demonstrates exactly how faith narratives are born, how they clash with secular academia, how they are documented in real time, and how they are fiercely protected by believers.
It truly is a unique historical intersection. And I'd like to leave you, the listener, with one final provocative thought to mull over regarding the extreme vulnerability of history. Think back to that Nauvoo house cornerstone where the original manuscript was placed.
Right, the black box that got ruined by groundwater.
Exactly. Imagine for a moment if the Masons had sealed that cornerstone perfectly, if it had been totally watertight. We would have the complete, pristine 600-page document of that initial dictation capturing every single phonetic error in Hebraic structure perfectly.
That would be amazing.
But conversely, imagine if the water damage had been absolute, if it had been entirely destroyed, and not even that surviving 28% was left for us to scan with multispectral imaging. How drastically would that alter the modern academic understanding of this text?
Wow. Without the fragments, we wouldn't have the phonetic spellings like where serifal to definitively prove the auditory dictation. It would just be Emma Smith's word against modern critics.
Precisely. We would be entirely blind to the physical mechanics of the room. And it makes you wonder, how many other ancient foundational texts throughout human history have their true complex origins completely hidden from us simply because their original manuscripts didn't survive the elements? How much of human history is shaped by what happens to survive water and time?
That is a fascinating thought. It brings us right back to the realization that history, especially the history of sacred texts, is incredibly fragile. You rarely get a clean, perfect timeline. Instead, you get water-damaged pages, eyewitness accounts filled with strange details, and physical artifacts that defy easy explanation. And you have to use every tool available, science, linguistic analysis, and historical context, to read what was written in the dark. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.